Hello and welcome, Sharkbait here, and today I'm going to be reading the first 9 pages of MetaZoo Cryptid Nation Chapter 1. I'm going to hopefully break these up into about 3 or 4 videos per comic and just expose more people to it because I love this story, I love the artwork, I love everything I do about MetaZoo. So, without further ado, here you go, MetaZoo Cryptid Nation Chapter 1. A Man from the Shadows. It was 3:01 a.m. November 15th, 1966. On a road like many others in the region, the cold air of a latter fall was pervasive and the leaves were just beginning to turn color in earnest. Although at this hour, the witching hour, the only colors that littered the ground were grays and blacks, and the soft glow of a small town not too far off in the distance touched them not. At this hour, the witching hour, shadows flooded every square inch of the road, and from these shadows a shape of a man began to emerge. To any average bystander, this man enveloped in the shadows would be just out of sight, but the click-clack of his dress shoes on the asphalt could still be clearly heard through the crisp air. To the keen observer, the trees and bushes on either side of the road were filled with creatures sitting, watching, and waiting. These observing eyes, only briefly noticeable to a normal person from the corner of their own, held both intelligence and fear, for they knew this man and what his arrival meant. The man from the shadows walked several paces and then stopped, and the trees on either side of the road and the air itself seemed to stop with him. Invisible to most, but most likely felt down the spine of every living creature within a 10-mile radius, an unnaturally large smile peeled across the man's face. His eyes began to glow that in no way illuminated the shadows before him. In fact, the shadows themselves seemed to grow darker. They appeared instead as 2 ghost lights suspended just 6 or 7 feet above the road, looking to guide unwary drivers to their doom. Slowly, but with confidence, as though he had all the time in the world, the man raised an arm to the fall sky and peered at the stars from between outstretched fingers. With a voice like the leaves that tumbled and scraped across the pavement at his feet, the man spoke through sharpened teeth. "The same stars. Not too long then. Roughly 1,000 years?" The space immediately around the man's arm then appeared to flex or bend for a brief moment, and the air just above his outstretched hand rippled as though there was a fine film resting on top of it, oily and slick to the touch, and distorting the brilliance of the stars he was looking at. Then, with a chuckle that could wither spring flowers, "I think it's about time. The veil is thinner here. Wouldn't you agree, old friend?" the man asked. The man's ghost-light eyes shifted from the stars above to look at 2 red glowing orbs, the size of a car's headlights, resting atop a large tree on the side of the road. These red eyes held a certain wicked intelligence, but no sign of the fear present in the other observers closer to the ground. Spilling from these eyes was a heavy shadow extending to the road and outwards into the sky like 2 colossal wings. Ingrid Cole's unnaturally large smile peeled back even farther. "Tell me what you see, old friend. Tell me the future. Tell me what you see, and I will do my great work." The man from the shadows continued down the road, skipping occasionally. As he passed a battered road sign that said, "Welcome to Point Pleasant," the man from the shadows began to whistle a merry tune. If you've ever watched a baseball game from a distance, maybe you could only afford one of those nosebleeders. The speed of sound is very much on display. The sight of the batter cracking the pitched ball always reaches you slightly before the matching crackling sound. The symbolism here is pretty on the nose, but no less worth pointing out. The farther away you are from something, the harder it is to make out the details, to see how everything is connected. And that was the case on one Saturday morning at 10:04 a.m. during a mid-morning heat one can only experience on the East Coast in August. To the many satellites that would take photos of the aftermath, and to the many more analysts that would try to make sense of the scale of the catastrophe, all that was seen was the appearance of the cryptid, code-named Mothman, above a Little League baseball game in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, followed by an explosion large enough to shatter windows over 100 miles away. This is by no means a unique event for that morning, a morning plagued by similarly unexplained and supernatural events. Events that only those that survived them, and survived them up close, could speak to the true story. And this was the case on that particular Saturday morning at 10:04 a.m. when the veil that was put into place over 1,000 years ago finally shattered. The middle school bleachers were littered with them. While wanted signs were a somewhat antiquated method of informing the general public about a threat, Point Pleasant was still a small enough town to warrant the extra measure. The figure on the signs was more shadow than man, but no one had ever gotten a good look at his face. All that was known was that he had appeared in town at hours and places he should not have, and people were afraid. No one paid these posters any heed, though, at least not right at the moment. Baxter Middle High's Mothmen were currently in the middle of delivering physical punishment to the out-of-county dragons from Cumberland Middle School, and the tensions were high. To many laymen, it appeared as though the Mothmen had risen in the national ranks of middle school baseball almost by magic. However, to those watching more closely, their recent fame could be explained entirely by the last-minute recruitment of two 8-year-olds, Sam Sinclair and Adam Akram. In comparison to many of the other players, many 4 to 6 years older than them, Sam and Adam were special in a way that was difficult to put your finger on. Sam knew, however, just how and in which ways he and Adam were special. The two 8-year-olds had what Sam described to himself as intuitions, because describing their abilities as power sounded almost too cliché, even to their preteen sensibilities. These intuitions took separate but equally useful forms, and each aided their ability to dominate baseball in different ways. Sam's intuition gave him the ability to almost see the different directions the ball might take before it even took flight. The clearest direction was more often than not the direction it took. Adam's took the form of feeling how the opposing players were going to act. While possibly more potent, Adam's intuition was certainly more abstract and therefore difficult to use, but he had fine-tuned it to such a degree that he often did better on the field than Sam. These abilities and the mystery of their origin were often discussed between the two childhood friends, and they kept it as a closely guarded secret in the way only the innocent can. For Sam and Adam to not only recognize their intuitions, but to also actively train and use them was apparently unprecedented. And use it they did. Sam had just secured a lead in the previous inning with a home run that was, at this point, par for the course every time he stepped up to bat. It was so expected that one of the outfielders from the opposing team actually pulled out his phone to check his messages when Sam teed up. Now in the final inning of the game with one out, the opposing team had their fastest runner, a boy named Chris, on second base, and Adam's intuition was screaming that he would try to steal third a split second before the pitch was made. Adam and Sam locked eyes as the ball flew, and Chris rocketed from second. Sam's gaze flitted to an area in the outfield where he knew the ball would go. Adam pivoted on his left foot and headed directly to that spot before bat even met the ball. A mere 7 seconds later, the game was won. The bleachers decorated with Indrid Cold's silhouette bent as parents launched themselves into the field to celebrate the Mothmen winning the Tri-County Championship for the first time in living memory. Sam and Adam smiled at each other through a sea of parents' arms and gloves and bats being discarded on the field by the defeated Dragons. It's hard to fathom what amazing stories these two would have embarked on had they had the opportunity to live life the way it should have been lived. It's hard to fathom what the world would have been had the veil not shattered, but shatter it did. Though the smile of victory and through the pouted faces of defeat, one sound emerged that tore through everything else. The sound seemed to come from afar and nearby all at once, and in many ways the sound came from within. The sound was not unlike the sound of metal tearing, and even though it only sounded for 3 seconds, it felt like hours to Sam. The sound finally stopped, and what was followed by what could only be described by many as an almost unnatural silence. Then, after nearly 10 seconds of shock, the screaming began. Miss Bergens, the local librarian who always brought chili dogs to every Little League match despite her own son dying by a drunken driver nearly 3 years ago, had at some point in the last minute caught on fire. Drake Ferguson, the pitcher for the Dragons, stood dumbstruck over what appeared to be the misshapen bodies of his parents, who moments before were consoling him on the loss of the game. Chris Gold, who a mere 2 minutes ago tried to steal second base, yowled in agony as his eyes turned into what could only be described as 4th of July sparklers. And so it was for every 10th person on the field. An affliction of sorts was changing their bodies, and it was somehow connected to the sound they had all heard, the sound they had all felt. Through all of this, Sam and Adam had maintained a locked gaze. And then, someone turned off the sun. No, that wasn't quite right, although the effect was much the same. More than anything else, more than all the chaos that had preceded that moment, the shadow cast upon the field and the thing casting it was enough for Sam and Adam to look up. It was a monster, and it had black wings. And piercing from this cold blackness, 2 colder red eyes, the same size of the sun they covered and just as bright. They searched the field and found Sam's eyes, and then a white light.